live with the students right now?
You're live with the students, and they all say a warm hello.
Hello to all of you, and thank you for joining me in this phone conversation today. Thank you.
It's such a pleasure. We've been looking forward to it. I'm going to give you my student, Emily, and they're going to pass around the phone and ask you a million questions, but they'll cut them down. Okay, here's Emily.
Okay, great.
Hi, Mr. Kovic.
Hi, Emily.
How are you?
I'm fine. It's a little after 1 o'clock in California, and I live in Redondo Beach, California. So it's a nice day out here.
Oh, it's raining out here, so I'm glad you have a little bit better weather.
Well, you're all welcome to come to the beach here today.
We might have to take you up on that. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
My first question was about your diary entries. What kind of diary entries did you write in Vietnam, and how did they help you write the book?
You mean born on the 4th of July?
Yes.
Yeah. During my first tour, I had a first tour of duty in Vietnam from 1965 December to 67 January. That was a 13-month tour for the Marines. For the Army, it was a 12-month tour of duty. I did not keep a diary during the first tour of duty, and I volunteered to go back to Vietnam a second time as a United States Marine Sergeant. And I arrived in Vietnam sometime around September of 67, and I was wounded on January 20th, 68. It was during that period that I began, once I left the States, I decided to begin a Vietnam diary. And I recorded every single day, even before I got to Vietnam. When I left Cherry Point, North Carolina, where I was stationed at the time, where I received my orders to go back after volunteering to go back to Vietnam. I pretty much kept the diary every day after that. When I flew across the country, went out to Oceanside, California for the training down at the Marine Corps base in Oceanside, getting ready to go over to Vietnam, and I pretty much recorded every single day. Now, I did not go back to the diary at all when I wrote Born on the 4th of July. I wrote 4th of July in the fall of, I believe it was 1970. I think it was the fall of 1974. A few days after Thanksgiving, I began writing Born on the 4th of July. But I went out and bought a $42 manual typewriter. There were no real computers used back then, and 500 blank sheets of typing paper. And strictly from my memory, I have a pretty good memory, I began to write Born on the 4th of July. There was a previous attempt to write the book about a year and a half prior to that, and I had only gotten, I was determined to try to write my story, and I lasted about 2 weeks, and then I pretty much gave up on the project. But this time, I was very determined, and in approximately one month, 3 weeks, and 2 days, I wrote the first draft of Born on the 4th of July. I never used the diary to answer your question.
So you didn't use the diary to write your book. What was the purpose of your diary entries? Were they kind of a catharsis for you?
I don't know. I just wanted I wanted a memory of exactly what I was going through. I knew I was, even back then as a young man, I knew I was participating in an extraordinary time in history, and that going off to war as a young man, and I wanted to have a record of that. I wanted to record that. I knew that Civil War soldiers had kept diaries, both the northern and southern sides. They had kept diaries during the war, and I just wanted a record of my experience so I could look back upon. It's amazing that I still have the diary to this day, and I have it in my other room, and it's a bit worn and frayed, but I still have it. It was very difficult, actually, to go back to that diary. It was painful. It's still difficult. It's very emotional when I go back and I read those passages, and I realize how much I changed after I came home from the war, when I became more and more committed to peace and nonviolence, and I became involved with the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and I, became passionately involved in my opposition to the war in Vietnam. Well, the diary is a very idealistic young man who's ready to serve his country, who's volunteered to go back to Vietnam a second time, who's literally willing to die for his country, who believes at the time that the government was telling him the truth and that the war was the right thing. And it's really quite a interesting contradiction between the diary, the way I wrote it, and my feelings, my patriotism, and not to say that opposing the war was not still patriotic, because I believe it was. Mm-hmm. How was that answer? Okay.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. I'm going to hand you to my classmate now.
Okay.
Hi, Mr. Kovic.
Who is this?
This is Grace.
What?
Grace.
Grace, Grace?
Yes.
Okay, Grace, thank you. Go ahead and ask me anything you want.
You said you wrote the book in, you said a month, right? A month
1 month, 3 weeks, and 2 days. I always remembered that. Yeah.
How did you write it so quickly?
How did I write it what?
So quickly.
So quickly? Well, I wrote lowercase. I wrote very, very fast. I had learned to type, actually, after Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. I went to boot camp in the September of 1964. After getting out of boot camp, the first school they sent me to after I graduated from Marine Corps boot camp was the Marine Corps barracks in Norfolk, Virginia, where I was sent to learn international Morse code. And I used to have to wear a headset and listen to did-it-dot-its, and I had to learn the code. And that's when I was with a bunch of Marines. We were at school every day in Norfolk, and I had to type the sound of the did-it-dots, and that's where I actually learned to type. I didn't know how to type before that. But when I wrote Born on the 4th of July, as I said before, I went to Sears and Roebuck. It's in Santa Monica, California, not far from where I was living at the time, and I bought a $42 manual typewriter and blank sheets of paper. But I would write every night until dawn. I would start at about 10 o'clock at night, and it just poured out of me. One thing I noticed, I was always a bit shy as a kid, and I always I didn't do that well in school. I felt uncomfortable in school, but one thing I was able to do, I realized I didn't realize it was a gift at the time, but I was always extremely prolific. Mm-hmm. I could always tell stories when I was a kid, or I could write stories off the top of my head. And when I took my first college course after getting out of the hospital in New York, after coming back from the war paralyzed, I went to Hofstra University on Long Island, and I took a couple of classes. One of them was a writing class. And back in my house on Long Island where I grew up, I used to put the manual typewriter on my bed, and I would have to type a short story once a week for the class. And I remember just, I would type for hours sometime. There was a whole timeless feeling about it, as if no time had passed at all. Oh, and it just came very naturally to me. I had this prolific ability to just, I love to write, and I could write for hours at a time. It just never bothered me. So that's what I did. I wrote all night long until dawn. Then I'd have maybe when the sun came up, I was living at a place called the Santa Monica Bay Club Apartments, 3 blocks from the Pacific Ocean in Santa Monica, California at the time. I'd moved out to California with a friend of mine from my old neighborhood, and I was living alone at the time, and I would start around 10 o'clock at night, and I was very determined, and I would write as many stories as I could remember about my childhood, about going to Vietnam. Some of the chapters, I usually would write I remember writing about 15 pages every night, and I would try to write every night, 7 days a week. But every once in a while, I get tired, and I take one night off, and I collect the manuscript every night, and I'd proudly put it on the dining room table. Then I'd go to my bedroom, and I'd sleep for a while, a couple of hours. Then I'd go out during the daytime and do what I had to do. But every night I'd be sitting behind that Brother manual typewriter working on Born on the 4th of July. I had 2 titles for the book, by the way. I had 2 ideas for titles. And my real birthday is July 4th. I was born on the 4th of July. And one of the titles was Yankee Doodle Dandy from the George M. Cohen song. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle Do or Die, real life nephew of my Uncle Sam, born on the 4th of July, that famous old song. And the other one was Born on the 4th of July, and I eventually chose Born on the 4th of July. And my editor in New York at the time agreed with that title, liked that title. It was, I don't know, there's something about that title that I always loved.
How did you like have any like final factors for choosing that, or you just liked it better in the end?
Would you say that again? I couldn't quite hear you.
Why did you end up choosing that title?
Oh, it just seemed like a classic title, a natural title. You know, whenever I've ever written, or whenever I've written any books, I've always chosen the title first. I've always had the title first. That seems to have spurred me on. I mean, I think in a way the title of a book, for me anyway, in particular, the title of a book is, to me, it has to represent the essence of what that book is going to be about, the very heart and soul of that book. The title motivates me, you know, it really does. It carries me through the whole book. I mean, I've got to have a great title. I'm determined. I mean, I have to have the really, it's got to be a great title for me to move forward, you know, on the long and often frustrating journey it is to write a book. You know, I wrote 4th of July very quickly, but then the book that I just had come out about a year or two ago, Hurricane Street, that took over 3 years. You know, so and the present book that I'm working on right now, I've already invested over 3 years in that book, and I was working on that book this morning when your professor called me.
Wow.
But that's okay. It was a nice break from the book. But I think it takes a tremendous amount of persistence, you know, and a willingness to. You have to love what you're doing, and you really have to. You have to have a desire to. I think my personal desire is to. I was just. You know, I had some very difficult times, very physically, emotionally, extremely stressful from combat experiences, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I was struggling mightily in the early years just to find a reason to keep living with what I had to deal with every day. And I think that the initial success of Born on the 4th of July, when it did come out, it ended up on the front page of the Sunday New York Times Book Review. It received a really wonderful review, and it gave me a lot of confidence. And I think success does, if you can have successes, and these little victories, they mean a lot. They gave me confidence, and where I had really lacked a lot of confidence as a student. I realized I did have a gift, and I did have something to give back. And to know that you have a gift inside of you, and you have an ability to give something back to the world, to touch people's lives, to, in fact, improve people's lives with the words that you write. I mean, it's really wonderful and powerful to realize that you have a purpose in this world, whether you're paralyzed or whether you lost this or lost that, and you feel that you're missing something in your life, whatever it might be, that you do have this gift inside, whether it's you're an artist, you're a painter, you're a writer, you're a speaker, or you're an organizer, whatever it might be, that you do have something to give back. You can make a difference. And what it does, it makes you want to stay in this world and continue to contribute for as long as possible. And that's what the success of 4th of July did for me. It made me believe in myself more than ever, and made me realize that I had something that I could continue, hopefully, to give back. You know, I had a gift, and I had a responsibility to share that and to be thoughtful about what I did write, so that I would not just write something to make money, but I would write in order to touch lives and hopefully change lives, and not only change other lives, but to awaken myself to understanding life even on a greater level than before, but also to change my life, to make my life better, to, like I say, to awaken myself, to inspire me. You know? I hope that helps.
That helps so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Kovic. I'm going to pass it on to my next peer. Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Hello, Mr. Kovic. How are you? My name is Maria.
Fine, how are you? Who is this?
My name is Maria. I'm good.
Well, what is your name?
Maria.
Maria, hold the phone like a
Maria. Okay, Maria, thank you. Go ahead, anything you want to ask me.
So my question for you is related to like the involvement of people of color in your life, and more specifically, I really wanted to see if you followed up on the black man that you said saved your life when you got injured.
You know, I'm not quite hearing you clearly. I'm not quite getting what you're saying.
You need to.
Could you say that again slowly? Yeah.
Like this, with this in your mouth.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. If you could just speak a little more slowly, I think I can catch what you're trying to say.
Okay. My question for you is related to the involvement of people of color in your life, and more specifically, I really wanted to know if you'd followed up on the black man that saved you when you got injured.
You know, I'm still not hearing what you're saying. I'm sorry, I just can't quite hear. I can't understand what you're saying on this connection here.
Let me try again.
Geez. Yeah, try again if you could, please. I'm trying to understand. I can't quite understand what you're saying. Yeah. Are you talking about the book?
Yes. All I hear is this.
Maria wants to know if you followed up on the black man who saved your life in Vietnam. If you stayed in touch.
No, I never did. And I never knew his name. And I'll be honest with you, when I came home, it was such. I just felt so overwhelmed by what I had gone through, especially on the 20th of January, when I was paralyzed. When the first man who came up to first Marine who came up to try to save me was shot in the heart and killed right in back of me, and then the black Marine came up from behind and just risked his life, grabbed a hold of me, and I wrote about it in the first chapter of Born on the 4th of July, and carried me back under heavy fire. You know, in a zigzagging motion, would drop me down, would pick me up, would drop me down, and with bullets flying all around us, and then suddenly disappeared. And I remember when the movie came out, let me see, 86, 90. When the movie came out in 1990, Born on the 4th of July, starring Tom Cruise, I received many, many phone calls. I was receiving 40, 50, 60 on my answering machine, phone calls every day. It was everybody you can imagine was calling me, from people I had known from high school, or girls I had dated in high school were calling me, all sorts of people, cab drivers from different cities who still had my number. And I got one interesting call from somebody who said that the black man who had saved me and carried me back, I didn't know what had happened to him, and I didn't have any desire to reach out and go back into that trauma, that emotional trauma again. I just was just trying to keep myself together during that period emotionally, because it was difficult to think about that time or go back to that time, even after quite a few years had passed. It was difficult. It was difficult to write 4th of July. I mean, there were times when I had nightmares and anxiety attacks while writing the book. I was having heart palpitations. I actually wrote Born on the 4th of July as my last will and testament. I really, at the time, it might have been survivor's guilt. I'm not sure exactly, but I really didn't think I'd live to be 30 years old. I began working on the book when I was 27, 28 years old, and I had gone through a very intense period with the anti-war movement and the Veterans Against the War. I'd been arrested nearly a dozen times. I'd been thrown out of my wheelchair by the police, thrown in jail, put on trial, and I had just taken this time off to take a break and try to write the book during this period. But to go back to it again, I think I was I was afraid to go back in and I wasn't ready at the time to have reunions or go back to even be with people who were with me on that day, to go back into that trauma. But when the movie came out, I want to say that I did receive a phone call from someone who told me that the Black Marine who had saved my life was killed later that day in an artillery attack. Now, I'm assuming it was true, but that's, I didn't know his name or anything, but someone had called me, but I do recall that. And I remember thinking to myself, the day that he saved my life and was able to get me to go back across the river to the battalion area, and then from there on to helicopters and C-123 airplanes down to Da Nang to the intensive care ward, and then off to Okinawa and back to the States, and the many, many years coming back from the war. The day he saved my life, he gave his own life. He died the day, only a few hours after saving my life. He never made it home like so many others.
Oh, wow. Ron, I'm going to ask you the questions now just because, I'm going to ask you the students' questions just because there's a little bit of a sound problem. But Les was...
Can they hear me?
Yes, they can hear you. Les was known about PTSD in the 60s. Did you have a therapist or someone who could help you find some relief?
No, I like a lot of veterans, I didn't want to have to deal with the federal government or the Veterans Administration. There was a whole phobia, concerning having to deal with a psychiatrist or having to go to a therapist. I'm sure you realize that, when you were growing up in the 50s and 60s, there was sort of this aversion. There still is to this day.
Right.
People are afraid if they admit that they're having, psychological problems because of experiences in the war, that they might not get a promotion, they might be drummed out of the service, and people are very sensitive about that. And too many people try to deal with it alone. It took me many, many years to finally realize that I needed to work with someone. I needed to work with a therapist. I needed to finally come to terms with some of the awful things that I experienced in the war and participated in. Mm-hmm. And it was then that I slowly began to move toward healing. It took a long, long time. I suffered a great deal, not only physically after being wounded. I did not share any of these horrors, these fears, these nightmares with my parents. I would suffer. I would wake up in the morning initially when I got out of the hospital in my bedroom that I'd grown up in as a boy on Long Island. And I would wake up and suddenly it would just wash over me that everything from my mid-chest down was paralyzed. I'd forget. For so long I was an able-bodied person. For so long I had my whole body, but here everything was numb from high up in my mid-chest down, everything. Nothing moved. I couldn't feel anything. I had a catheter inside of me, and I would wake up to that in my bedroom. That was quite an adjustment, leaving the paraplegic ward at the Bronx VA and coming back to my house, and all of a sudden I'm not around other men like me, other wounded paraplegics, but I'm alone back in my room, and I wake up in the morning, and I remember I would begin to get nauseous, and the only way my heart would start to pound, and I would just feel like I was going to scream, and I'd drag myself out of bed, my paralyzed body, into the wheelchair, and rush into the bathroom, and I'd stick my finger down my throat, trying to make myself throw up, and I'd dry heave over the toilet bowl until I was exhausted, and tears were rolling down my face. And that's the only way that I could break that terrible anxiety that I would feel. Almost every morning I woke up throwing up over the bathroom bowl, forcing myself to throw up so that I wouldn't scream and I wouldn't yell. I just felt very haunted for a long time. That's how the mornings would begin. But the evenings, sometime around dusk, as it began to get dark, I would begin to have anxiety attacks almost every night. I would feel like my heart would be pounding. I suddenly feel like I was about to die. I couldn't explain it. I had never experienced anything like this before. I sensed that it absolutely had to do with the war and what had happened to me. It was not only that I had been paralyzed, not only that I had gone through that particular, that trauma on that particular day, but there were other experiences during that second tour of duty. The ambush where all the children were killed and many other things that happened, many other things that I was forced to witness. And this is what young men go through, especially young men and women now who experience combat, whether it be in Iraq, Afghanistan, or those of us who are in Vietnam, and even back to World War II. And you can go back to other wars, World War I, the Civil War. I mean, war is just a terrible trauma. What war does to human beings, physically and psychologically. It's one of the main themes of the book that I'm writing right now about my own journey from the psychological and physical devastation of war. How to move beyond that, how to overcome that, how to not give up, how to not quit. So many suicides. It's understandable why young men who just beginning their lives would feel overwhelmed, to wonder, how can I ever live another day? And I used to think that way. I used to think, how am I going to get through this? I mean, I just feel so overwhelmed physically, emotionally, and I have no one to talk to about this. I did not talk to my mother, my father, or any or fellow veterans. I just kept it to myself, and I suffered silently for a long time. This is not only what I went through. I want you to know this is what soldiers, men and women, not only in America but around the world, what they go through when they go through the intense experience of war. What war is it's just such a violent thing. Not only is war immoral, not only is it insane and stupid and foolish and senseless, but what it does, when they say we've got to send our young men, and then when they come home, they have these platitudes. What they say is, thank you for your service. They call everybody who puts on the uniform these days heroes, and I think the real heroes are the ones who have the courage to say no to particular policies. We had many young men during the Vietnam period that said, "We're not going to fight your war. We're not going to pull triggers. We're not going to kill other human beings. We're going to go to Canada. We'll leave this country before we go along with your policy. Your policy is wrong. It's immoral. There's something terribly wrong about it." So to know that you have the right to resist the policy of your own country, and to know that in many ways that is an act of patriotism in itself. To know that you have a right to say no. You have a right to say, I don't agree. I won't give you my body. I won't throw my body away for your senseless war because it's not worth it, and I'm not going to harm other human beings. So I mean that takes courage too.
Ron, we've all seen the movie and read your book, and it's all about your transformation between soldier to anti-war hero, and I'm not using that word lightly. But were there particular incidents in your life that led you to become an anti-war person? Absolutely. There were key moments, and I can cite several of them right now. I mean, the first thought that comes to my mind is Kent State, May 4th, 1970, when I believe it was several Kent State students were shot and killed for peacefully protesting the war in Vietnam at Kent State University in Ohio. And that affected me deeply. That actually led that weekend to my first major demonstration that I allowed myself to participate in Washington, D.C., and that demonstration is a chapter in Born on the 4th of July, if you recall, when I go down with my
cousin's husband, Skip. We go to Washington, D.C., and I'm very affected by that first demonstration, and it moves me very deeply. Another one was when I'm asked by a fellow veteran at the Bronx VA to join him at Levittown Memorial High School on Long Island to speak for the first time against the war. And I'm very afraid and I'm very anxious about speaking. I'm at Hofstra University at the time, and I'm living in an apartment in Hempstead, Long Island, not far from the university. I've already left my parents' house, and by the way, I left my parents' house after several arguments with my father over the war. I was becoming more and more opposed to the war, and my father still supported the war, and we would have arguments, and finally got to the point where I decided to leave the house. And I was living alone in this apartment, and I was very lonely, actually, to be honest with you. And my friend Bobby Muller, who was on the paraplegic ward with me at the Bronx VA in New York at the time, he was a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and he was also paralyzed in the war. I was on that ward with all the paraplegics, all the wounded from the war. I was around them every day. I mean, I saw some of the worst injuries that would come home from war. Well, that affected me too deeply. To actually to be on that intensive care ward in Da Nang, to see people struggling for their lives, the pilot to my left at the intensive care ward dying right in front of me. I mean, I saw what war does to human beings, not just my own injury, but there were injuries all around me, and I was witness to that. So that affected me very deeply. Kent State affected me very deeply. You know, that demonstration affected me. I have to go back to, of course, my own paralysis, my own personal experience of having lost 3/4 of my body in the war, and just the different incidents that happened in the war, which haunted me, continued to haunt me for years, you know, before I was finally able to make some semblance of peace and forgive myself. That was very important, forgiveness, finding a way, because I was very hard on myself for many years. I felt very guilty. I felt very ashamed of what I had done, and I wondered if I could ever forgive myself. I think for a long time I lived, you know, sort of balancing on the fence between living and dying. I mean, I think there was a part of me that wasn't sure whether or not I deserved to live after what I had gone through, what I had experienced. You know, I felt a great deal of shame. I felt a great deal of embarrassment, and I felt that I had let my parents down. I felt that I had let the country down, and I was very tormented in many ways for a long time. And at first I was very quiet, you know, it was sort of a quiet rage. But eventually I became, especially when I became involved in the anti-war movement, it was a real outlet for me. And I became very, very angry as I began to associate, began to understand what the war was really all about. I became more and more committed to stopping that war, to working every single day. I mean, I remember during that period in the early 70s when every day was crucial, making sure that I could keep another young man from either dying at 19 or having to come home wounded like myself. I mean, every day I could do to stop that war. And let me see what other things influenced me. I remember watching television. I mean, things as simple as the Woodstock, watching that, and watching the Columbia University sit-ins in New York, just watching this rebellion happening all around me, these protests happening, and going to the university. I remember some of the books that influenced me. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, about the terrors of colonialism in Africa, and I remember connecting that to Vietnam, the similarities between arrogance in going into Vietnam, the arrogance of these countries going into these third world countries not knowing anything. I mean, we continue to practice that to this day. We go to Iraq and Afghanistan, we know nothing about these people, nothing about these cultures. And all we have to offer them is violence, you know.
Yeah. Ron, we have so many questions, but I want to skip ahead to now, and we can move backwards if we have time. But you wrote later about your experience being a blessing in disguise. How has this transformation occurred in your life?
Experience of what? What? Experience of what?
A blessing in disguise. I just want to...
Oh, a blessing in disguise.
Yeah,
oh, no, I do now. I mean, this is my 50th year back from the war, half a century for me and many others like me. The first thought I have is on gratefulness. Gratefulness was really one of the reasons why I'm alive right now, why I feel as positive as I do right now, why I'm so very grateful every day for, no matter how difficult, and it's still difficult physically, it's still a challenge. It will always be a challenge for me, being a paraplegic. It is a challenge on multiple levels, but I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to still be here after all these years. I'm thrilled to still be moving forward toward becoming a better person, toward being able to forgive those who may have harmed me, to be able to move beyond the war, to transcend the war, to transcend the anger and the hate, and to fill my heart with love and understanding. I mean, this is so important. I mean, I think that we all will experience traumas in our lives. They don't necessarily have to be wars. And I hope not for any of you. They are wars. But we experience loss in our lives. You will, grief in your lives. You will experience feelings of defeat and feelings of giving up and humiliation. Nobody gets through this life without being knocked down. The important thing is to get yourself back up. One of the things I wanted to share with you is one thing I would say to people when they ask me, well, how did you get through all of those years? How did you continue on and not give up? Well, so many around me did give up. So many friends that I had with similar injuries during that period, during the war years, are long gone, whether it be drug overdose or car accidents. I mean, the casualty list for those who came home and had been traumatized by the war psychologically and emotionally. Not only in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, we see, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we see 18 to 22 suicides a day. It's unbelievable. I think the importance of never giving up, and no matter how defeated you may feel in life, no matter what mistakes you may have made, and what you feel, you may make terrible mistakes. You may that you regret. But I think you must always push on, push forward, and never give up. I think that's the key. You've got to make it. You've got to give yourself time, and it's very difficult, when you're younger, to realize these things because you're very impatient, and you do tend to feel. Especially when I was younger, I tended to feel overwhelmed and really do not be so quick to judge. Do not be so quick to feel that you never know, what's on the other side of the coin. There's always two sides to the coin. When I talk about my life has now been a blessing in disguise, in many ways, I had no idea at the time that my wound would become symbolic, would help to promote peace and nonviolence. And my life, my story that I wrote with that $42 typewriter would eventually lead to a major motion picture, major film star, and it would influence millions of people. I could not have imagined in the intensive care ward, denying as I was in and out of morphine and had all sorts of tubes connected me, and I was just trying to live every day, just trying to keep breathing, that I would ever eventually be able to survive all of that and influence millions of people with a simple book that I wrote right off the top of my head. it proved to me that, we all have that potential as long as we are willing to not give up and to try and to continue to try to. I remember when I was first injured, I was telling you I felt so overwhelmed when I would wake up in the morning. But I also remember thinking to myself, I remember I had this thought on the importance of our imagination in surviving. I remember thinking to myself, I know how I feel right now, but how will I feel 6 months from now? How will I feel 10 years from now, 20 years? Perhaps somewhere out there, there'll be a turning point where there'll be a victory of some kind. I had no idea at the time that victory would be, a best-selling book, a major motion picture, touching millions of people, or becoming a symbol of peace and nonviolence. I never had any idea because, initially when I joined the Marines, I was so inspired by John F. Kennedy and so committed to, being the best Marine that I could be. I never imagined. So we never really know how the whole thing's going to play out. And we might feel initially, how could anything ever be worse than what's just happened to me right now? And the truth is, if you're patient, if you don't give up, if you let this play out, and if you allow the whole picture to unfold, you may realize that sometimes the greatest tragedies lead to some of the greatest triumphs.
Ron, I'm supposed to be asking you about film, but I have another personal question, and that's about love. And I know when you were injured, you were afraid that no one would love you, and I know now you talk about your girlfriend. Have your feelings about...
I have a wonderful girlfriend, and I'm
tell me about your feelings about love.
Happier than I think I'm happier than I've ever been. I've never been married. I never had children. I can't have children with my injury, but I always think another book is another child in a way. But I think being able to move beyond that, to love again is really a great achievement. I think, especially after the bitterness and the frustration and the periods of hopelessness that I felt during those earlier years. I think meeting Terry Ann, our anniversary next month, we will be 11 years together. That's the longest relationship I've ever had. I'll tell you, I usually joke with people, and I say, before I met Terry Ann, my longest relationship was an hour and a half. And I had to begin counseling after the first half hour, But I just didn't. I was 20 and I was paralyzed and I was deeply insecure. I could not have sex anymore the way I could have had. I mean, I had to deal with a lot of deep insecurities and fears. And that's one of the reasons why I went off to Mexico to see if I could find a girl. I mean, I think there was a part of me all throughout all those years, even during the anti-war movement, was in a way searching for love, trying to find, if I could just find that one person, if I could just, find that love seemed to be, it seemed to be the answer. I mean, there's no doubt that being committed against the war was a major turning point in my life, and it was a very important. And I remain deeply committed to peace and nonviolence to this day. I remain committed to alternatives, finding alternatives to war and violence as a way of solving our problems. I'll always be committed to that. That is what the war did to me. It moved me. It allowed me to see war for the terrible thing that it is, and allowed me to realize that there are millions of people around the world who feel the way that I do. That as human beings, we have to strive with everything we have within us to find alternatives to this type of behavior. That this type of behavior is barbaric, and it's crazy, and it causes such heartache. And we are intelligent young men and women. We are intelligent people. I know we're inventive, we're creative, we're innovative. I know that there's got to be a way to solve this. We must do everything possible to find a peaceful solution before we ever think of resorting to any kind of violence. I mean, we owe that to ourselves as human beings,
Ron,
to find a more peaceful, gentle, nonviolent approach. And, there may be times when a certain amount of strength is needed, but, I encourage everybody to do everything possible to find alternatives to going, other than going to war. The consequences of war they're just awful. They're terrible. I've experienced them. I've lived with them for 50 years. I remember them, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to move beyond them. As you say, to love again, to have someone, to hold somebody's hand, to go to the movies, to just have a companion, to have that wonderful feeling of hugging somebody. I mean, in many ways, when I'm with Terry Ann, I feel stronger, and when we're together, I forget about the paralysis. She says to me that, I don't even think of you as being paralyzed. I realize it every day, but in a way, love is a cushion, it allows you to cushion a lot of the pain and the anguish that we experience in life. So I encourage all of you to find love as soon as possible if you haven't.
Thank you. We're working on it. The students will be mad at me if I don't ask you a couple of film questions.
Sure, yeah.
You were a co-author of the script, is that right?
Yeah, Oliver Stone and I co-wrote the script. Yes, we did. Together. Between him coming down to my rented house in Redondo Beach and me driving up in my hand-control car to the house he was living in at the time with his wife at the time, Elizabeth, in Santa Monica, yeah. By the way, we were searching for actors for Born on the 4th of July. And, when my book came out and the book got a great review on the front page of the Sunday New York Times Book Review, there were, just from that review alone, I received a call from an agency in New York, and there was interest in the story as a movie. The people who had not even read the book yet had read the review, and that was enough for them. Marty Bregman, who had produced Dog Day Afternoon in Serpico, contacted me from his house on Long Island, and he asked me, he wanted to take an option on the movie. He also, at the time, worked with Al Pacino, and I remember I met with Al Pacino, and that was the first attempt in New York. That's when I met Oliver Stone for the first time, actually. He had just come back from writing Midnight Express. He was to win his first Golden Globe Award for Midnight Express, and I believe he also may have been nominated for an Academy Award for Midnight Express. So Oliver was a Vietnam veteran, and one thing led to another. We were working with Pacino in New York. This was in the 80s, and this late 70s, early 80s, and we got within 4 days of. We had cast all the characters in New York, and we got within 4 days of principal photography of beginning to actually shooting the film, and it was canceled because I had worked with Jane Fonda and the screenwriter Waldo Salt on the movie Coming Home. Have any of you ever seen the Academy Award-winning movie Coming Home, starring John Boyd as a paraplegic and Jane Fonda? Anyone in the class?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just raise your hands. I can see your hands. You can raise your hands.
I saw a lot of hands. Right.
A few people have seen it, yeah?
Yes.
So I worked on that. I had to leave that project and work on the 4th of July project with Pacino, and that fell through. So that fell through, and it was a bit of a heartbreaker for Oliver Stone and myself. And I would see him from time to time. We remained friends, and he was still a struggling screenwriter. Nobody really knew his name. He had a Vietnam script that nobody seemed interested in doing. It was called Platoon, which eventually became a phenomenal success, won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and Oliver won for Best Screenplay, Best Picture. It had tremendous success, and it was a big breakthrough for Oliver. And after Platoon, he had the opportunity to do whatever film he wanted, and I think, what did he do? He did Salvador. Salvador was his first film, and then Platoon, and then I think it was, I believe it was Wall Street next, or Talk Radio, Wall Street Talk Radio, and then I got a call from Oliver Stone. He was in New York, and he was finishing up the movie Wall Street, starring Charlie Sheen and Martin Sheen. And he asked me to come to New York, and he was interested in trying to make 4th of July. Oh, I remember when we were in New York, we were in an elevator, and 4th of July had just fallen apart, and we were about to go our separate ways. We were really depressed because we had come so close to making that film, and then all of a sudden the dream disappeared. And Oliver promised me, if I ever make it in Hollywood, if I ever become a director, I'll come back to you, Ronnie. I'll come back to you, and I'll make one on the 4th of July. Well, finally, after Platoon, he was in the position to do that, and he called me, as I said, when they were finishing up Wall Street in New York, and asked me to come to New York. He said, we're going to try again. Let's see if we can do it this time. And eventually we did.
Wonderful.
After meeting with, we met with Charlie Sheen, we met with Sean Penn, and then Tom Cruise became interested, and eventually we chose Tom Cruise to portray me, and he did a great job. He was nominated for an Academy Award. He won the Golden Globe.
Now,
he was tremendous.
when you see the film now, is there anything you would change? We were curious about the scenes in Mexico and the way some of the Mexican women were portrayed, some of the Mexican men. Is there anything?
No, I wouldn't, because I know people say, well, women shouldn't be portrayed that way, and that's a sexist way to portray women. But it was the truth. That's the way it was. And I thought, especially after the war and all of the lies and all the deceptions which led my generation to Vietnam, I think writers of my generation, one of the most important things was to strip this thing naked, was to never allow that lie to lead us into being damaged ever again. And I think it was very important that we told the truth as we saw the truth to be. And this is what we experienced. I mean, this is what I experienced, as degrading as it might seem. I mean, I was lining up with other men in my wheelchair, waiting to sleep with one of the whores in the whorehouses because I felt so insecure sexually after being paralyzed, and I felt so inadequate in the States, and I was having such difficult time even finding anybody who I felt would want to even go out with me in a wheelchair. And at least in Mexico, in the houses of prostitution, I know as outrageous as it sounds, I was able to experience women for the first time as a young man. I grew up Catholic, and I grew up, I never made love. I never made love to a woman. I never had that first sexual experience. I never had that. I mean, I was paralyzed before I could ever experience that. And I could never, ever use anything below my mid-chest ever again. It was gone forever, and it was really, it was devastating. It was as devastating as being paralyzed. But not only that, but there were the other traumas of the war, which had affected me just as deeply as, having lost that sexuality, having lost the use of my body. It's in many ways people who sustained the losses that I did. As I look back upon it, it's really miraculous that we could actually come back from that, actually love again, forgive, and move beyond that, and actually have a sense of humor about it all in the end.
Right.
It's amazing.
Generosity to
it's amazing the resilience that we have as human beings, as long as we don't give up.
You've already given my students some advice, but we're nearing the end of class. Do you have any particular advice for young peace activists about what kind of actions are the most effective, about what kind of work they should be doing?
What they should be doing what?
What kind of work, peace work, they should be doing?
Well, do their homework. Kidding you. No, but work they should be doing in what? In what particular area?
Marches, working in
Well,
politics.
I think, first of all, that's for everyone to choose. I think we do have a responsibility. We are not just responsible for ourselves. I think we have a responsibility in regard to our country and our world that we live in. And that if something is wrong or immoral, or something that is not just, I think we have a responsibility to speak our minds, to not be afraid, to take action. It's not always easy. Martin Luther King talked about the difficulty of breaking the silence of the night. That's another thing you asked me, the influences I had. When I first came home, I was reading Robert F. Kennedy's book, To Seek a Newer World, just before he was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in June of 1968. And I was at the St. Albans Naval Hospital on Long Island with other wounded Marines when I watched on television and saw that Dr. Martin Luther King had been killed in Memphis on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. And so, I mean, his commitment, these men, as I got to know who they were more and more, they influenced my life. And I think it is important that we find people that we can admire and respect for their commitment. I think we have a responsibility to each and every human, to each other, to ourselves, to our communities, to our country. We're not alone, in this world. We are all together in this. We have a responsibility to move our country in a positive direction, in a peaceful direction, in a sane direction, toward being honest and truthful rather than toward lying and deceiving. I think it's very important. We have that responsibility. Participate in demonstrations, yes, if you choose to, but you can also write poetry. You can also paint. There are many ways to express your opinions, and it's up to all of you to find the ways that you feel most comfortable with. Not everybody's not going to want to participate in a demonstration. Not everyone's going to feel that same passion.
Ron,
but I think we all do have responsibility to give back and contribute, yeah.
We saw Dan Ellsberg in a documentary saying that not everybody gets to hear or see a role model who's given up so much for peace, and that's what you've been to my students today, and I'm very grateful to you.
Oh, thank you. When I think of role model, I think of being in a wheelchair and I'm still rolling, so that's my role model.
That's great. That's great. Okay, may I call you?
I feel a little bit embarrassed when people say that I'm a role model, and I kind of wheel my chair. I've done it for years, and I say, well, I'm still rolling. If you mean rolling in a wheelchair, that's me. Well, listen, always remember to have a sense of humor.
Okay.
And you can overcome anything as long as you keep trying. Don't give up, and try to maintain as positive an outlook as you can. I'm looking right now over at the book on my bookshelf here, The Power of Positive Thinking. So Norman Vincent Peale's book, but try to be as positive as you can, and have faith that things will get better. I don't know how you feel about the present situation in our country right now, but
not so good.
Just believe that. And also, one other thing I want to say is the importance of tolerance, the importance of respecting everybody's opinion. You may be conservative, you may be liberal. We are all human beings. We all have a right to our opinion. We all have a right to say what we feel. That's what democracy is supposed to be about, what freedom of speech is supposed to be about. So you do not hate another human being. One of the things that Gandhi taught us was, you must not belittle the person you oppose. You must not, you must respect them, even though you disagree with them, and even disagree with them vehemently. I think it's important that we respect each other's opinion, that we can all function in this world. We can have a dialogue without having such polarization. And as much as this country is polarized right now, it's important that we begin to respect each other. That we can always find something in the other person that we may disagree with, that we can admire or that we can love, and it's really important that we build bridges of understanding with one another, not just in the classroom or in the different interactions you have, maybe even with your family members, but also with other countries as well. It's so important that we find ways to create bridges rather than dropping bombs.
Right. Ron, thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I'd like to, 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 yeah, I'd like